One of Speyside's oldest distilleries, Glenfarclas has been called the king of single malts. And in this video, we're going to take a look at the history of the distillery and how it earned this well-deserved crown. So here we are in the fantastic tasting room at the Glenfarclas Distillery. This wood panelling that you can see all around has actually came from the Empress of Australia, and this came from the first class smoking lounge. And the site today is somewhat unrecognisable from the early days, but the distillery is located on the moors of Banffshire, and Glenfarclas sits a mile away from the River Spey and nestles at the foot of the Benrinners Mountain. The Gaelic translation of the name Glenfarclas means Valley of the Green Grass, which is an indication of the rich pasture land which surrounds the distillery. Robert Hay, a tenant farmer, officially founded and licensed the distillery at Wrechlary Farm in 1836, although there is evidence that there was an illicit distillery operated at the site from as early as 1791. Following Hay's death in 1865, the farm and distillery were left vacant, attracting the attention of a prominent local family of cattle breeders, the Grants. John Grant and his son George regarded Wrechlary Farm as an ideal halfway staging post between the existing Grant farm at Glenlivet and the Elgin cattle market, and negotiated a tenancy agreement in 1865. As part of the Wrechlary agreement, the Grants also purchased the Glenfarclas Distillery for a sum of £511 and 19 shillings. As farming was John Grant's priority, Glenfarclas was initially leased to John Smith of the Glenlivet Distillery, although Smith resigned after 5 years to establish the Cragganmore Distillery in 1870. After Smith's departure, John and George Grant founded J&G Grant Limited to operate Glenfarclas in 1870, with George Grant taking over distillery management. In 1889, John Grant passed away, with George Grant taking control of Glenfarclas at Wrechlary Farm. A year later, in 1980, George Grant also passed away, leaving his widow Elsie to take over the Glenfarclas licence, while his eldest sons John and George ran the distillery. In 1895, John and George Grant took over the Glenfarclas licence and established the Glenfarclas Glenlivet Distillery Company Limited, holding a 50% partnership with Pattison, Elder & Co of Leith. The original Glenfarclas farm was demolished and rebuilt as a modern Victorian distillery or distilling plant in 1896. In 1898, the Glenfarclas Glenlivet Distillery Company Limited partnership dissolved abruptly as a result of the infamous Pattison whisky crash, which left Pattison, Elder & Co bankrupt and the Grants in a dire financial predicament. Committed to rebuilding the Glenfarclas' financial stability, John and George Grant reformed J&G Grant Limited, acquiring the Pattison interest in the distillery, although with the combined cost of the rebuilding work, Glenfarclas only survived by mortgaging and selling whisky stocks to R.I. Cameron, an Elgin-based whisky broker. 15 years later, Glenfarclas' financial future was secure and the distillery's whisky had attained a reputation as a high-quality malt, leaving a rival distiller to write in May 1912, "Of all the whiskies, malt is king. Of all the kings, Glenfarclas reigns supreme." In this turbulent time, Glenfarclas' spirit of independence had been born, which saw the Grant family commit to the principle of keeping Glenfarclas as an independent, family-owned and operated distillery going forward. Ill health forced John Grant to begin stepping back at Glenfarclas in 1914 before fully retiring in the early 1920s, after which George Grant continued to manage the Glenfarclas distillery alone. In 1948, Glenfarclas belatedly celebrated the distillery's Centenary Anniversary. It was mistakenly believed at the time that the Glenfarclas Distillery was established in 1845, with George Grant opting to postpone the celebrations until the end of the Second World War. George Grant passed away in 1949, leaving his sons George Scott Grant and John Peter Grant to inherit Glenfarclas. George S. Grant's early years as Glenfarclas Company chairman coincided with a period of rapid growth and expansion for the Glenfarclas Distillery. After the Second World War, a relaxation of wartime barley rationing, combined with the repeal of the 1880 Spirits Act in 1952, allowed Glenfarclas to increase production to meet blenders' demand for the post-war blended whisky boom. In 1960, the Glenfarclas Distillery was expanded from 2 stills to 4 stills, doubling production capacity. However, by the late 1960s, demand for whisky began to decrease, resulting in Glenfarclas losing a major blending contract. George S. Grant decided to lay down more stock for producing official distillery bottlings rather than having Glenfarclas rely on the blenders. In 1968, Glenfarclas became the first distillery to release a cask-strength single malt, a bottling that would eventually be renamed Glenfarclas 105 and remains available to this day. From 1972, Glenfarclas's on-site distillery floor maltings were decommissioned and malted grain purchased centrally. In 1973, Glenfarclas also became one of the first distilleries to open a visitor centre at the distillery site, and in 2019 they welcomed 28,000 visitors. George S. Grant's son, John L. S. Grant, joined Glenfarclas in 1974, and a further 2 stills were installed in 1976, bringing the total to 6. Many of Glenfarclas's distilling traditions were established under George S. Grant's leadership of the distillery. Alongside a number of neighbouring Speyside distilleries, Glenfarclas uses spring water sourced from the Ben Rinners Mountain for distillation, although it is one of the few distilleries which has retained stills that are being heated by direct fire, believing that this method adds more weight to the distillate. In 1981, Glenfarclas experimented switching to steam heating, concluding that this method produced a weaker and blander new make spirit. Renowned for its traditional full-bodied and rich sherried style, Glenfarclas uses a combination of first fill and refill ex-Oloroso sherry casks for maturation. All Glenfarclas's cask wood is sourced from Jerez-based Spanish cooper Jose Miguel Martin, who produces a selection of butts and hogsheads from European oak in a business relationship that's lasted over 25 years. In 1986, Glenfarclas celebrated the 150th anniversary of legal distilling at the distillery. After working alongside the Glenfarclas Distillery from the 1790s, the Recleary farms ceased operating in 1988. Following 52 years as Glenfarclas's company chairman, George S. Grant passed away in 2002 and was succeeded by his son, John L. S. Grant. Over the years, Glenfarclas has released an increasing number of older and well-aged bottlings, now offering a range of single malt expressions and limited edition releases varying from 10 to 60 years old. George S. Grant's decision to lay down more stock for distillery bottlings, a practice which even continued during the 1980s whisky lockdown turn, has resulted in Glenfarclas having significant volumes of aged stock, evidenced by the on-site warehousing facilities. Their warehouses hold in excess of 50,000 casks at present. Commemorating the bicentenary of John Grant's birth, a Glenfarclas 50-year-old was released in 2005. In March 2006, Glenfarclas was named Distiller of the Year by Whisky magazine, receiving the award for being consistently good and staying true to its core values. Glenfarclas's depth of aged stock was revealed fully in 2007 with the relaunch of the Family Casks range, a series of single cask bottlings originally from 43 consecutive years from 1952 and 1994. The Family Cask series vintages now range from 1954 up to 2010, and they're all available here in the Visitor Centre. Celebrating the 175th anniversary of the Glenfarclas's founding in January 2011, a commemorative bottling was launched which vatted whisky from the oldest available 1952 casks, with casks of spirit distilled in each of the 5 successive decades. In June 2015, celebrating the 150th anniversary of the Grant family ownership of the Glenfarclas Distillery, the £511 19 shillings Family Reserve was released. This rather cryptically named bottle was a reference to the price that John Grant paid for the Glenfarclas farm in 1865, with the bottling including a replica of the original bill of sale. One of the most spectacular limited releases was the Glenfarclas Family Trunk, released in 2018. This collection contains 50 200ml bottles of the Family Cask collection dating back to 1954. There's actually one on display in one of the warehouses here at the distillery too. It's presented in a leather cabin trunk, which resembles sort of traditional shipping luggage, which is apt given that we're in the first class smoking lounge of from the Empress of Australia steamer ship. And a total of 60 Glenfarclas family trunks were produced and originally were available at £100,000. The one that's available in the distillery today is priced at £120,000. In 2020, the Spirit of Speyside Festival, which celebrates the whiskies of the Speyside region, was cancelled due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Despite this, Glenfarclas still released the distillery's Spirit of Speyside Festival edition bottling, which was called the Stillman's Dram. Each year, different members of the Glenfarclas distillery team select a whisky for the festival, and in 2020, the choice went to the Stillman. So there we have it. It's the history of the amazing Glenfarclas Distillery. And if you're ever in Speyside, this has got to be on your list of distilleries to come and visit. Not only is the tour fantastic, but the staff are really, really friendly and helpful. Matthew, the guy who took me around this morning, did a fantastic tour, and it's quite a relaxed, casual atmosphere. In some distilleries, you might feel like you're being sold to for 90 minutes. And here it's just a very relaxed, really friendly atmosphere, and that is sort of really to sort of be recommended. At the end of the tour, you get a tasting as well. Obviously, I can't do that because I've got a lot of driving to do today, but they've given me a driver's kit, so kudos for that too. And if you want to let me know what distillery you want me to do a history on next, get in the comments below and I'll see what I can do.